Emily, what's on your radar?
Well, I was thinking just back to a couple years ago when I wrote about Fox News, Greg Gutfeld of Fox News' eye-popping ratings. The ratio of news coverage to viewers compared with the ratio of media coverage to viewers for comedians like Sam B said something profound about the media bubble. There's always so many more stories about Sam B, despite the fact that she was much less influential. It still does say something profound about that. It's kind of the coming apart thesis in practice, a consequence of elite sorting. Call it the law of rotten tomatoes. Why do critics love National Geographic's fawning Fauci documentary while audiences hate it? Why do critics hate the sharp new Chappelle special while audiences love it? Why is the consensus so different between classes? Because journalists have similar backgrounds, lifestyles, and tastes. The incentives to question that dogma are now very low, and the incentives to champion the dogma are very high. So despite being on cable, Gutfeld is now the #2 host in late night behind only Stephen Colbert. Colbert, despite a legendary run at Comedy Central, now inspires more cringes than laughs. He's nearly unbearable. So why is he the king of late night? This is an example I always use to illustrate a trend that gets way too little attention. Colbert and Gutfeld are now averaging somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 million viewers, according to Nielsen. That may seem crazy because Colbert is sharing the same top slot as, say, Johnny Carson, whose last year on The Tonight Show was pulling in triple the nightly viewers just 30 years ago. So what's the big deal? This is a story about the business of commercial art as much as the quality of it. But it's political, too. Gutfeld is an instructive foil for 2 reasons. First, he's on cable, which has undercut the network's power along with streaming. And second, because he's politically incorrect, which is an advantage since all the comedians whose asses he's kicking insist on following rules that needlessly handicap them. And yet, that doesn't explain Colbert. He's not as funny, but he is, as Gutfeld recently said, Sesame Street for Democrats. And there's a market for that. In this era of media fragmentation, so long as you corner the market on a niche, you can pull in 2 million viewers and win the late night race. So if there's a market for cringy boomer resistance comedy, and there is, then all you have to do is produce that low-hanging fruit better than anyone else. That's how you explain Stephen Colbert. This has obvious upsides. It means scrappy alternative shows like Rising have more power than certain shows on dusty cable platforms like CNN. It means places like The Intercept and The Federalist are more powerful than they could have been before. One story I've been following closely at The Federalist is the Daily Wire's very intentional and well-funded campaign to compete with the Hollywood establishment. Just last night, the Daily Wire announced that it'll release Terror on the Prairie next spring, anticipating more vaccine mandates in the film industry. That's their new movie with Gina Carano. But do you see what's happening here? When Disney booted Carano from The Mandalorian, the Daily Wire immediately collaborated with her on this new film. As Ben Shapiro told me himself back in August, quote, "We entered the entertainment space in order to deliver a message to Hollywood. You no longer have a monopoly." So why can a conservative media outlet make that claim in 2021 to Hollywood from a conservative media outlet? Because streaming makes the barrier to entry lower, which allows more players to compete. Political correctness is then creating niches that are easier for new competitors to fill. So every industry is starting to have kind of its own version of Substack thanks to both of these forces. An upside is that heterodox celebrities like, say, Gina Carano increasingly have landing pads outside the industry establishment, which incentivizes artistic freedom and integrity. A downside is that encourages us to stay divided, to cluster in niches that let us share more with fewer than less with more. So maybe you found Johnny Carson to be vanilla. Maybe, like me, you love political comedy and find the kind of comedians who made and make it in mass media to be uninteresting. When you have to appeal to everyone, you have to be a little less offensive, especially now. But without Johnny Carson and the mass media he thrived in, we are not forced to confront what we share. We are encouraged to emphasize what makes us different and live in that universe. So maybe you love Jezebel and Lindy West and fourth wave feminism. You can watch Shrill and The Handmaid's Tale and never have your values questioned. Mass media was quickly a success and then also quickly a casualty of technological advances. This will have advantages and disadvantages, but the least we can do is start by recognizing right now that we are in a very different place and it's influencing our culture and the culture wars in dramatic ways. Ryan, the point is that the more we're sort of divided into these niches, which are incentivized by the current business landscape of the streaming environment, we're just basically fragmented, and we're clustering in all of these different pockets. You don't have mass media figures like a Johnny Carson to pull us all together. So while there were disadvantages of the mass media model, one of the advantages was that it did kind of force us to, you had the writers sitting in writers' rooms saying, like, what will make America laugh tonight? And there are disadvantages to that model, but if you translate that to like Substack, or you translate that to newsrooms, what does America care about today? What's going to make the most number of people laugh the hardest on tonight's show? There was sort of a way that it fostered something healthy, and I think we just don't realize that we're missing that.
Right. Yeah, it does raise the question of how do you put together a common kind of American project in a way that, from the Great Depression, up through the, let's say, the 1960s, 70s or so, was considered the norm. And there's kind of a boomer bias to the understanding of how mass media exists, because for boomers, that's always how it was, even though that's the exception.
Right.
Before the Great Depression, really before radio, individual communities really had their own media ecosystems, and also when it rose to a national level, national publications had their own very peculiar politics. Like the New York Times was founded as kind of a radical Republican, kind of abolitionist newspaper that was serving like a very particular, political viewpoint.
The Atlantic.
The Atlantic, and the Times weirdly drifted into being kind of pro-business, anti-civil rights very quickly after the Civil War. But it showed the way that everything was kind of fighting it out in the same way that happens now among podcasts, among YouTube, among what used to be the blogosphere on Twitter, and there is no kind of common project that comes out of that.
And I think the point you made is exactly right, that there's a boomer bias, but there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that we don't realize, and this was sort of the point of the radar, we don't realize that we've lost it. And actually recognizing that we've lost it, and that was not a permanent fixture of American life, as you say. Before mass media, we were already in our sort of communal niches, but recognizing that is gone, I think, is a huge key to understanding partially why we don't get along anymore. We don't share a lot of the same cultural touchstones. You can't go to the proverbial water cooler or Slack and say, did you all watch Carson last night and see what he said about Joe Biden or see what he said about Donald Trump? We don't share those things anymore, and it affects everyday life, I think, in dramatic ways, and the least we can do is at least recognize that we've lost it, and that I do think unlocks somewhat of the key. That's sort of a key that unlocks partially what our problems are. Right,
and you layer on top of that the fact that we're more transient than ever. Where somebody lives as an adult is not as connected as it used to be to where they grew up.
So important.
And so you don't have that community bond either, which makes people much more willing and to distrust each other.
Right, and that's such an important point. And these spaces, by the way, are more and more sort of intensely ideological. So you can watch, again, the example I used was Shrill, which is like, it would be sort of unthinkable for a network 20 years ago to greenlight a sort of pro-abortion show about a fairly radical feminist journalist. It's not exactly Murphy Brown. and so if you're in that, if that's sort of you, if that's your thing, if that's your taste, you can never leave that space. You don't have to watch things that aren't sort of tailored to the millennial female urban experience, and that's shaping us as well, because we're not forced to confront alternative viewpoints or shared consensuses on a lot of things, and so we're not really forced to think about them.
Or when you do leave your space, you're shocked that there are people who disagree with you. I think about the poor sap who ran the ACLU's media feed.
Yes.
And just posted something that they thought was completely anodyne.
Right.
It's like taking some transphobic language in RBG's quote
and editing it so it was no longer transphobic, and that's just what everyone in their social set would have done in that situation. It would have been offensive to suggest otherwise. Post that, and boom, other people see it and are like, wait a minute.
Whoa.
You're editing Ruth Bader Ginsburg's like iconic quote about women? What's wrong with you?
That's a great example, because in the past, you would constantly sort of be forced to grapple with those things. But you can see how if you kind of graduated from one of our institutions of higher education, went straight to work for the ACLU, or went to work for sort of left of center groups in a major city, you would not think twice about that, because you have been told, you've been conditioned to believe that everything outside of your viewpoint is transphobic, is bigoted in some way, and so you don't have to confront it and you don't have to deal with it. And the only other thing that I would add to all of this is how it kind of shapes the way that we see each other, how it shapes the way that we interact with each other. Being in these silos, it's a trade-off. Like it definitely has advantages, it definitely has disadvantages. But the point is that we sort of just at least need to recognize that that's where we are, and we can move on from there. But
I can agree with that. Yeah.
Right, Ryan, I'm looking forward to what's on your radar next.